There are questions that should never be asked aloud. Questions whose answers lie buried beneath decades of silence, hidden behind locked doors and burned letters. Questions that, once spoken, unravel entire lives like thread pulled from rotting fabric. In the spring of 1847, a young enslaved woman named Dinah asked such a question. She asked it only once, in a voice barely above a whisper. Standing in the doorway of the plantation house kitchen, the man she asked, the overseer, a brutal figure named Horace Vance, was found 3 days later swinging from the oak tree behind the stables, his own belt around his neck, his face frozen in an expression witnesses would later describe as knowing. But Dinah's question didn't die with Vance. It spread through the quarters like fever, whispered in the tobacco fields, murmured over cooking fires. And as it spread, other secrets began surfacing, secrets that had been carefully maintained for nearly 2 decades, secrets that involved the master's family, the bloodlines of the plantation, and a truth so disturbing that it would eventually consume everyone who touched it. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation in Lunenburg County, Virginia, where a simple question about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror far worse than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of Thornhill Plantation and the question that destroyed it, I need you to do something. If this introduction has already given you chills, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because stories like this one, buried deep in America's darkest history, are what we uncover here every week. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's discover what Dinah saw that spring morning and why her question could never be answered safely. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's rolling Piedmont, its main house a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The estate sat on land that had once been hunting grounds for the Saponi people before they were pushed westward by colonial expansion. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild purchased the property with money made from the tobacco trade, no trace of the original inhabitants remained, except for the occasional arrowhead turned up by a plow. The plantation had belonged to the Fairchild family for nearly 50 years by the time our story begins. Colonel James had built the main house in 1802, importing craftsmen from Richmond to create a structure that would announce the family's status to anyone who passed. The house featured a grand entrance hall with a curving staircase, parlors on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room that could seat 20, and upstairs, 6 bedrooms with tall windows that overlooked the tobacco fields stretching toward the river. Behind the main house stood the dependencies, the kitchen house, built separate to reduce fire risk, the smokehouse where meat was cured, the dairy with its cool stone floor, the laundry where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs, the carriage house and stables, the overseer's cottage, and beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild had died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, Edward's father, also named James. This second James Fairchild had run Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 of what the doctor called apoplexy, a stroke that took him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning. He was 41 years old. Edward Fairchild, then just 28, had inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings whose names were listed in the estate inventory between the livestock and the furniture. He had been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had 1 infant daughter who would die of scarlet fever before her 2nd birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 years old and looked older. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly grey. His face had the weathered quality of a man who spent his days outdoors, inspecting fields and checking accounts. He was not a tall man, perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone conscious of his authority. His eyes were pale grey, almost colourless in fights and they rarely showed emotion. Catherine had died in 1838, giving birth to their only surviving child, a boy named Thomas. The birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had bled too much afterward. The doctor from town had done what he could, but infection set in. She lasted a week, feverish and delirious, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand, saying nothing. When she finally died, he had her buried in the family cemetery on the hill behind the house, beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9 years old, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's delicate features. He was being educated by a tutor from Richmond, a stern Presbyterian named Mr. Gaines, who believed in Latin, mathematics, and the rod. The boy showed aptitude for learning but little enthusiasm. He spent his free hours reading in the library or wandering the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 souls that spring of 1847. The number fluctuated, births and deaths, occasional sales and purchases, but it had remained close to 50 for the past 15 years. Most worked the tobacco fields that stretched from the main house to the river, their days measured by the sun's arc and the overseer's watch. Tobacco was demanding. It required constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September, and even in winter there was work to be done. Stripping leaves, preparing beds for the next year's crop, repairing equipment. Others worked in the house, the stables, the smithy, the kitchen. There was a hierarchy among the enslaved people, as there always was. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled craftsmen held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt superior to those purchased from elsewhere. But these distinctions meant little in the end. They were all property, all subject to the same absolute power, all vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. Dinah was 19 years old that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Dinah was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a chambermaid, responsible for cleaning the bedrooms, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the personal needs of the family. She had been a quiet woman, Dinah remembered, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had taught Dinah to read, secretly, dangerously, using a Bible she'd somehow acquired, and had told her daughter stories about her own mother, who had been brought from Africa as a child, and who remembered the ocean crossing in nightmares that lasted her whole life. Ruth had died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that killed 6 people on the plantation. Dinah, then 12 years old, had nursed her mother through the final days, wiping her burning forehead with cool cloths, giving her sips of water, listening to her delirious ramblings. In those final hours, Ruth had said things that made no sense to the child Dinah. Apologies, warnings, names that meant nothing. She had gripped Dinah's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinah hadn't understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Dinah had been moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60 years old. She didn't know exactly, as enslaved people rarely knew their precise ages. With grey hair, she kept wrapped in a cloth and hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She was the closest thing to a mother Dinah had after Ruth died, teaching her to cook, to manage the kitchen's routines, to navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people who could punish you for any perceived slight. Dinah was quick with her hands, quiet in her manner, and possessed of unusually keen powers of observation, a trait that would prove both gift and curse. She noticed things. The way Edward Fairchild's jaw tightened when he was angry, the way Mr. Gaines's eyes lingered on the younger enslaved women, the way Horace Vance seemed to take pleasure in others' fear. She noticed patterns, connections, resemblances. She had a brother named Samuel, 2 years younger, who worked in the stables. Samuel had been born in the summer of 1830, and from early childhood had been marked by his unusual appearance. While most of the enslaved people at Thornhill bore the deep brown skin common to their West African ancestry, Samuel's complexion was noticeably lighter. What was was sometimes called bright in the parlance of the time, or more cruelly, yellow. His features, too, were different. A narrow nose, thin lips, and those same pale grey eyes that marked the Fairchild bloodline. Such things were not uncommon on plantations throughout the South. Everyone knew what they meant, though no one spoke of it directly. Mixed-race children were a visible reminder of the violence and exploitation that undergirded the entire system, and their presence was managed through silence and deliberate ignorance. Masters didn't acknowledge their enslaved children. White wives pretended not to notice, and the enslaved people themselves learned to keep silent because speaking the truth could get you sold away or worse. But Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was more than a matter of coloring. As he grew from boy to young man, the similarity became impossible to ignore. He had Edward's build, tall and lean, with broad shoulders and long limbs. He had Edward's way of tilting his head when listening, as though considering what was being said from multiple angles. He had Edward's long fingers, Edward's straight posture, Edward's habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. By 1847, at 17 years old, Samuel looked like he could have been Edward's son, which of course he was. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved people had known since Samuel was a child, had watched Ruth's shame and silence, had understood the implications. They knew that Ruth had been young and pretty when the old master, Edward's father, had taken notice of her. They knew that she'd had no choice, that no was not a word enslaved women could say to white men. They knew that Samuel was the result, and that Ruth had carried that burden until it killed her. Even the white workers, the overseer, the tutor, the occasional merchants who visited, must have noticed. How could they not? Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was written on his face, in his build, in his mannerisms. But knowing and speaking were different things entirely. The system depended on this silence. As long as no one said it aloud, as long as the truth remained unspoken, the fiction could be maintained. Edward could continue as master, Samuel could continue as property, and the fundamental lie at the heart of the plantation could persist. The lie that said blood didn't matter, that family didn't matter, that a man could own his own brother and it was perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. Until Dinah asked her question. The morning of April 23, 1847, began like any other. Dinah rose before dawn in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women, Mary, who worked in the laundry, Patience, who worked in the fields, and old Aunt Sarah, who was too old for heavy work now and spent her days mending clothes and watching the small children while their mothers worked. The cabin was perhaps 12 feet square with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper. There were 2 narrow beds, rough wooden frames with rope supports and straw mattresses, and a fireplace where they cooked their own meals when they had time and ingredients. Dinah dressed in the dark, pulling on the same dress she wore every day. Rough homespun cotton, dyed brown, mended in a dozen places. She wrapped her hair in a cloth, slipped her feet into worn shoes, and made her way through the pre-dawn darkness to the kitchen house. The path from the quarters to the kitchen was well worn, a track through the grass that hundreds of feet had traveled thousands of times. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and growing things. Spring had come early that year, and the trees were already fully leafed, their branches dark against the lightening sky. Birds were beginning to sing, mockingbirds and cardinals and the harsh caw of crows. Bess was already in the kitchen when Dinah arrived, as she always was. The older woman seemed to need less sleep as she aged, rising earlier and earlier, as though trying to stretch her remaining days. She had already built up the fire in the great hearth, and the kitchen was warming, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the lingering scents of yesterday's cooking. "Morning, child," Bess said, without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Morning, Aunt Bess." They worked in comfortable silence, as they did most mornings. Bess kneaded bread while Dinah fetched water from the well, filled the large kettle and hung it over the fire to heat, brought in eggs from the henhouse, sliced ham from the joint hanging in the smokehouse. The kitchen was a separate building, perhaps 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was built of brick, with a slate roof, designed to contain any fire that might start. The main room held the enormous fireplace with its array of hooks and cranes, a long work table, shelves of dishes and pots, barrels of flour and cornmeal, strings of onions and dried peppers hanging from the rafters. By 6 o'clock, they were preparing the breakfast that would be carried to the main house. Biscuits, ham, eggs, coffee, preserves made from last summer's peaches. Young Thomas took his breakfast in the dining room with his tutor at 7 o'clock sharp. This was Mr. Gaines's rule, part of the discipline he believed essential for a boy's education. Edward ate later, usually around 8, in his study while reviewing the plantation's account books. The routine was invariable, had been the same for years. Dinah could have performed her tasks in her sleep, and sometimes felt that she did, moving through the motions while her mind wandered elsewhere. This morning, though, she was thinking about Samuel. Her brother had been in trouble again. 2 days ago, he'd been caught near the main house after dark, where enslaved people had no business being after the workday ended. He claimed he'd been looking for a lost tool, but Horace Vance didn't believe him, or didn't care whether it was true. The overseer had announced that Samuel would receive 10 lashes as punishment, to be administered this afternoon in front of the other enslaved people. As a lesson. 10 lashes. Dinah had seen whippings before, had heard the crack of the whip and the cries of pain, had seen the bloody stripes left on backs. 10 lashes wasn't the worst. Some people received 50, 100 beatings that left them unable to work for days. But 10 was enough to scar, enough to hurt, enough to humiliate. And for what? For walking near the house that his own father owned. For existing in a space where his presence reminded everyone of the truth they all pretended not to know. Around 8 o'clock, Dinah was carrying a tray of fresh biscuits from the kitchen to the main house when she encountered Horace Vance on the path. The overseer was a thick-bodied man of perhaps 50, with a red face perpetually flushed from drink and sun, and small eyes that seemed always to be calculating. He wore rough work clothes, canvas trousers, a homespun shirt, heavy boots, and carried a short whip coiled at his belt. Not the long whip used in the fields for driving workers, but a personal implement he used for what he called correction. Vance had been overseer at Thornhill for 8 years, hired by Edward after the previous overseer died of a heart attack. He was efficient, brutal, and utterly without sentiment. He saw the enslaved people as livestock to be managed, and he managed them with fear. He had a reputation throughout the county as a hard man, someone who could handle difficult slaves, and Edward paid him well for his services. Vance stopped Dinah on the path, his bulk blocking her way. He looked at the tray she carried, then at her face, his small eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Dinah," he said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that was somehow worse than open hostility. "Morning, Mr. Vance." She kept her eyes down, as was expected. He reached out and took a biscuit from the tray without asking, bit into it, chewed slowly. Crumbs caught in his beard. He was standing close enough that she could smell him. Sweat and tobacco and something sour. "Your brother's getting his lashes this afternoon," Vance said conversationally. 3 o'clock by the tobacco sheds. "You'll be there to watch, I expect." It wasn't a question. When punishment was administered, everyone was expected to watch. It was part of the lesson. "Yes, sir," Dinah said quietly. "Good." Vance took another bite of biscuit. Boy needs to learn his place. Getting too big for his britches, thinking he can wander where he pleases. Can't have that. Got to maintain order, you understand? "Yes, sir." "Your mama understood that. Ruth knew her place, knew how things worked. You do well to be like her." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Pretty girl like you, smart girl. You could do well here if you keep your head down and your mouth shut." The implication was clear, and it made Dinah's stomach turn. She said nothing. Just stood there, holding the tray, waiting for him to move. Finally, Vance stepped aside. "Better get those biscuits to the house before they get cold. Master Edward don't like cold biscuits." Dinah hurried past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She entered through the back door into the warming kitchen, a small room where food was kept hot before serving. From there, a narrow hallway led past the butler's pantry to the dining room. As she approached with the tray, she heard voices. Thomas and his tutor, Mr. Gaines. The dining room door stood slightly ajar. Dinah paused, not from curiosity, but from training. Servants learned to pause before entering rooms, to listen for a moment to gauge the mood, to avoid interrupting at an inopportune moment, to make themselves invisible until needed. Through the gap, she could see Thomas seated at the long mahogany table, his Latin primer open before him. The book looked enormous in front of the small boy, its pages covered in dense text. Mr. Gaines stood beside him, one hand on the back of Thomas's chair, the other pointing to something on the page. The tutor was a thin man of perhaps 40, with a narrow face and dark hair combed severely back. He wore a black suit, as he always did, and carried himself with the rigid certainty of a man who believed he knew God's will. Again, Mr. Gaines was saying. The conjugation, first person singular, present tense. Thomas's young voice, hesitant. Amo. Louder. Speak with confidence. Amo, amas, amat. The morning light from the tall windows fell across Thomas's face, illuminating his profile. The sharp nose, the pale eyes, the thin mouth, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was wearing a white shirt with a stiff collar, dark trousers, shoes that had been polished to a shine. A child dressed as a small adult, being molded into the master he would someday become. And in that moment, Dinah thought of her brother, thought of Samuel, who at this very moment was probably mucking out stalls in the stable, his hands rough and calloused, his clothes stained with manure and sweat. Samuel, who would be whipped that afternoon for the crime of walking near the house that his own father owned. Samuel, who had the same pale grey eyes as the boy sitting at that table, the same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head. The resemblance was striking. It always had been, but somehow in this moment, with the morning light falling just so across Thomas's face, it was undeniable. They could have been brothers. They were brothers, half-brothers, sharing a grandfather, sharing Fairchild blood. But one sat at a mahogany table learning Latin, destined to inherit land and wealth and power, and the other cleaned stables and would be whipped for walking in the wrong place. The anger came suddenly, unexpectedly, a hot surge that rose from her chest to her throat. It was not a planned thing, not a calculated risk. It was simply the breaking point of years of accumulated silence. Years of watching her mother's sadness, years of seeing Samuel treated as property while bearing the face of the family that owned him. Years of swallowing truths that everyone knew but no one could say. Dinah pushed open the door and entered with the tray. Mr. Gaines glanced at her with the blank expression white people reserved for servants, seeing her function but not her face, acknowledging her presence only as one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that had moved. Thomas didn't look up from his book, still focused on his Latin conjugations. Dinah set the tray on the sideboard and began arranging the biscuits on a serving plate. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to control them. The anger was still there, hot and insistent, demanding release. And then, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, she said, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room became very still. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse, impossible to ignore. Dinah continued arranging the biscuits, her hands moving automatically, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Mr. Gaines turned slowly. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock, and something that might have been fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, barely controlled. Dinah didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. The question had been heard, had been understood, and now it existed in the world, real and undeniable. Thomas looked up from his Latin primer, his young face confused. "Which brother?" he asked, with the innocent directness of a 9-year-old who didn't yet understand why this question was forbidden. "Who does she mean?" "I didn't know she had a brother." Mr. Gaines's face had gone from pale to red. He took a step toward Dinah, one hand raised, then seemed to think better of it. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his black suit. "Get out," he said very quietly. "Get out now." Dinah left the tray, left the biscuits half arranged, left the room. She walked through the hallway, through the warming kitchen, out the back door. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, as though she were watching herself from a distance. She crossed the yard to the kitchen house and went inside, closing the door behind her. Bess was at the work table, rolling out dough for pies. She took one look at Dinah's face and set down her rolling pin. "Child, what did you do?" Dinah couldn't answer. She sat down on the kitchen's back step, in the doorway, and waited for the consequences to arrive. Her hands were still shaking. She clasped them together in her lap and stared at them, at the brown skin and calloused palms, at the hands that looked like her mother's hands. What had she done? She had spoken the truth. That was all. She had asked a simple question, pointed out a simple fact. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? But she knew, even as she sat there, that there was nothing simple about it. She had violated the fundamental rule. She had named the thing that must never be named. She had torn away the veil of silence that allowed the system to function. And now she would pay for it. Bess came and sat beside her on the step. The older woman didn't say anything, just sat there, her presence a comfort. They waited together in silence, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up, voices calling, tools clanging, the distant lowing of cattle. After perhaps 20 minutes, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on the path. Dinah knew who it was before she looked up. Horace Vance appeared at the kitchen door, his face redder than usual, his small eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been excitement. He was breathing hard, as though he'd been running. "You," he said, pointing at Dinah. "Come with me, now." Bess stood up quickly. "Mr. Vance, sir, she didn't mean nothing. She's just a foolish girl who don't know when to keep quiet." "I said come with me." Vance's hand moved to the whip at his belt, his fingers caressing the coiled leather. Dinah stood. Her legs were steadier now, her mind clearer. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no point in resisting, no point in running. She had nowhere to run to. She followed Vance out of the kitchen, leaving Bess standing in the doorway, her face stricken. They walked not toward the whipping post near the tobacco sheds, as Dinah had expected, but toward the main house. Vance led her around to the front entrance, something enslaved people never used, and up the steps to the wide porch with its white columns. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with brass fittings. Vance opened it without knocking and pushed Dinah inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool after the bright morning sun. Dinah had been in this space before, of course, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving quickly through on her way to perform some task. Now, being marched through by the overseer, she felt exposed, wrong, like a piece of furniture moved to an inappropriate place. The hall was grand. A black and white checkered marble floor, a curving staircase with an ornate banister, a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, portraits of Fairchild ancestors on the walls. To the left was the parlor, to the right the library, and straight ahead, past the staircase, was the door to Edward Fairchild's study. Vance brought her to that door and knocked sharply. "Enter." The study was a large room lined with books, dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Edward sat behind it, his hands folded on the leather surface, his expression unreadable. Mr. Gaines stood to one side, his face still pale, his hands clasped in front of him. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Vance pushed Dinah forward into the center of the room, positioning her in front of the desk like a prisoner before a judge. "This is the one, sir," Vance said, "the one who spoke out of turn this morning." Edward looked at Dinah for a long moment. His pale grey eyes, Samuel's eyes, showed nothing. His face was calm, almost expressionless. but there was something in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, that suggested controlled fury. "Repeat what you said," Edward commanded. His voice was level, quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Dinah's mouth was dry. She tried to speak and couldn't. Her tongue felt thick, useless. "I said repeat it." Edward's voice remained level, but something cold moved beneath it, like ice beneath still water. "I asked." Dinah's voice came out as a whisper. She swallowed and tried again. "I asked why young master looks like my brother." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Vance seemed to hold his breath. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Then Edward said very quietly, "Which brother?" "Samuel, sir. Samuel, who works in the stables." Edward's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. He looked at Mr. Gaines. "You heard this?" "I did, sir. In front of young Master Thomas." The boy asked questions. He wanted to know who she meant, said he didn't know she had a brother. Edward nodded slowly. He was still looking at Dinah, his gaze steady and cold. "And what did you hope to accomplish with this question? What did you think would happen?" Dinah didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. She hadn't thought about consequences, hadn't planned anything. She had simply spoken. "Do you understand what you've done?" Edward continued. "Do you understand that you've disrupted the order of this household? That you've planted ideas in my son's mind that he's too young to comprehend? That you've violated every rule of proper conduct?" Still, Dinah said nothing. What could she say? That the question had been burning in her mind for years, that she was tired of the lie, that she wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge the truth. Edward stood up from his desk, walked around it, and approached her. He was not a tall man, but standing this close, he seemed to tower over her. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the tightness of his mouth. "Your mother knew her place," he said quietly. Ruth understood how things worked. She never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. She accepted her lot and lived her life accordingly. He paused. "You would do well to follow her example." The mention of her mother sparked something in Dinah. "My mother died sad and silent," she said, her voice stronger now. "She carried secrets that ate her from the inside. Is that what you want? More silence? More secrets?" Edward's hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side, making her ears ring. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "You will not speak to me in that tone," Edward said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "You will not question me. You are property. You exist at my sufferance. Do you understand?" Dinah said nothing, just stood there with her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Edward turned to Vance. "Take her to the root cellar. Lock her in. I'll decide her punishment later." As Vance grabbed Dinah's arm and pulled her toward the door, Edward added, "And bring Samuel to me. Now." The root cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door set at an angle against the ground behind the kitchen house. Vance pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. He shoved Dinah toward the opening. "Down you go," he said. Dinah descended the steps carefully, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness. The cellar was perhaps 10 feet square, with a low ceiling supported by wooden beams. The walls were stone, cool and damp. The floor was packed earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding barrels of apples and potatoes, crocks of preserved vegetables, hanging bunches of dried herbs. The air smelled of earth and vegetables and something faintly rotten. Vance followed her down, holding a lantern. He hung it on a hook, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then he looked at her, his small eyes moving over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know," he said conversationally, "you're a pretty girl. Smart, too. It's a shame you don't know when to keep your mouth shut." He took a step closer. "Things could go easier for you if you were friendlier." Dinah backed away until she hit the stone wall. "Mr. Vance." "Hush now." He reached out and touched her face. his fingers rough against her skin. "No need to be scared. I'm just saying, you be nice to me, I'll be nice to you. I could talk to Master Edward, tell him you're sorry, tell him it won't happen again. I got influence here." Dinah turned her face away from his touch. "Please don't." Vance's expression hardened. "You think you're too good for me? That it? You think because you can read and work in the house that you're better than the others?" His hand moved to her throat, not squeezing but resting there, a threat. "You're nothing, you're property, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." He held her there for a moment longer, his hand on her throat, his face close to hers. Then he stepped back, picked up the lantern, and headed for the steps. "You think about what I said," he called back. "Think about whether you want a friend or an enemy." He climbed the steps and slammed the door shut. Dinah heard the heavy bolt slide into place, locking her in. The darkness was absolute. The cellar had no windows, no source of light except what came through the cracks around the door, and that was minimal. Dinah stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. But there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was complete. She felt her way along the wall until she found a corner, then sat down on the dirt floor, her back against the cold stone. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small. And she waited. Time passed strangely in the darkness. Without light, without sound except the faint creaking of the floorboards above, Dinah lost track of how long she'd been there. It might have been an hour, might have been 3. Her eyes played tricks on her, showing her shapes and shadows that weren't there. Her mind wandered, drifting between memory and imagination. She thought about her mother, about Ruth's final days. The fever had come on suddenly, as it often did. One day Ruth had been fine, working in the house as usual. The next day she was burning up, delirious, unable to stand. Dinah had been 12 years old enough to help nurse her, but too young to understand that her mother was dying. Ruth had said strange things in those final days. She had talked about the ocean, though she'd never seen it. That was her own mother's memory, passed down. She had talked about a man with pale eyes who had taken something from her that she could never get back. She had apologized over and over, though Dinah didn't know what for, and she had warned Dinah, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinah understood now what her mother had meant. Ruth had been violated, used, forced to bear a child to a man who owned her, and she had lived with that shame and silence for 17 years, watching her son grow up bearing the face of his father, knowing that everyone knew, but no one could say. It had eaten her from the inside, had killed her as surely as the fever had. And now Dinah had broken that silence. She had said aloud what everyone knew. She had asked the question that should never be asked. What would happen to Samuel? Edward had ordered him brought to the study. What would the master do to his own son, his own brother's son, now that the truth had been spoken aloud? Dinah's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from above. Footsteps, rapid and heavy, voices raised in alarm. More footsteps, running, shouts. Something was happening. She stood up, felt her way to the steps, climbed them, and pressed her ear against the door. The sounds were muffled but clear enough. People running, people shouting, a woman screaming. Then, cutting through all the other sounds, a scream unlike any Dinah had ever heard. A man's voice, raw with terror and pain, screaming words she couldn't quite make out. The screaming went on, rising and falling, sometimes forming words, "No, no, please, God, no," and sometimes just pure sound, the sound of someone in unimaginable agony. Then it stopped abruptly, cut off mid-cry. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming had been. Dinah pressed her forehead against the door, her heart racing. What had happened? Who had been screaming? Was it Samuel? Had Edward done something terrible to him? She pounded on the door. "Hello, someone. What's happening, please?" No one answered. The sounds above had changed. No more running, no more shouting. Just low voices, urgent and frightened, and the sound of something heavy being dragged. Dinah pounded again, harder. "Please, let me out. What's happening?" Still no answer. She gave up and returned to her corner, sat down, wrapped her arms around herself. She was shaking, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. Hours passed. The sounds above gradually returned to normal. Footsteps, voices, the routine sounds of the plantation day continuing. But no one came to the cellar. No one brought her food or water. No one checked on her. The darkness pressed in. Dinah dozed fitfully, woke, dozed again. She was thirsty, hungry, terrified. She thought of Samuel, wondered if the screaming had been him, wondered what Edward had done. She thought of her mother, wondered if Ruth was watching from wherever the dead went, wondered if she approved or disapproved of Dinah's question. She thought about truth and silence, about the cost of speaking and the cost of staying quiet. She had broken the silence, and now everything was falling apart. But hadn't it been falling apart all along? Hadn't the lie been eating away at everything, rotting the foundation, poisoning everyone it touched? More time passed. Dinah lost track of whether it was day or night. In the absolute darkness of the cellar, time became meaningless. Finally, it might have been 6 hours later, might have been 12. She heard the bolt slide back. The door opened and light flooded in, painfully bright after so long in darkness. Dinah shielded her eyes, squinting against the glare. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. As Dinah's eyes adjusted, she saw it was Bess, holding a candle, her face streaked with tears. "Come on, child," Bess said softly. "Come on out of there." Dinah climbed the steps on shaking legs, her muscles stiff from sitting so long. She emerged into what appeared to be late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. She had been in the cellar for perhaps 8 hours. "What happened?" Dinah asked. "I heard screaming. Was it Samuel? Where is he?" Bess shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Samuel's gone, child. They took him away this afternoon, sold him to a trader heading south. He's gone." The words hit Dinah like a physical blow. "Sold? But hush now, that ain't the worst of it." Bess took Dinah's arm, steadying her. "Mr. Vance is dead." Dinah stared at her, unable to process the words. "What?" "They found him an hour ago, hanging from the oak tree behind the stables. Used his own belt. His face." Bess shuddered. "Lord have mercy. His face." They say his face looked like he'd seen something terrible, like he'd seen the devil himself. The death of Horace Vance sent shockwaves through Thornhill Plantation. The enslaved people gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating, afraid. The white workers, the few hired men who helped with specialized tasks, kept to themselves, their faces pale and frightened. And Edward Fairchild locked himself in what remained of his study, seeing no one, speaking to no one. The body had been discovered by Jacob, the old man who tended the horses. He had gone to the stables around 4 o'clock to begin the evening feeding, and had found Vance hanging from the massive oak tree that grew behind the building. The overseer's belt was wrapped around his neck, the other end tied to a low branch. His feet were perhaps 6 inches off the ground, his face purple and swollen, his eyes bulging. But it was the expression on that face that had sent Jacob running for help, screaming, because Vance's face, despite the distortions of strangulation, showed not pain or despair, but something else entirely. His mouth was open in what might have been a scream, his eyes wide with what looked like recognition. As if, in his final moments, he had seen something, understood something, that had filled him with such horror that death had been preferable to living with that knowledge. The county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dawes, had been summoned from town. He examined the body, examined the scene, questioned everyone who might have seen or heard something. His conclusion was straightforward: suicide. Vance had climbed the tree, tied his belt to the branch, and jumped. These things happened. Men sometimes took their own lives, for reasons known only to themselves. But Sheriff Dawes couldn't explain why a man like Vance, brutal, practical, seemingly without conscience, would suddenly kill himself. He couldn't explain the expression on the dead man's face. He couldn't explain why Vance's personal effects, when examined, showed no indication of despair or planning, No note, no settling of affairs, no indication that he'd been contemplating death. The enslaved people had their own theories, whispered in the quarters after dark. Some said it was God's judgment, divine retribution for Vance's cruelty. Some said it was Ruth's ghost, come back to avenge her children. Some said it was something darker, something that had been awakened by Dinah's question, by the speaking of truth that should have remained silent. Old Aunt Sarah, who claimed to have the sight, said she'd seen Vance's ghost already, walking near the stables, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, his face still wearing that expression of terrible knowledge. Others claimed to have heard sounds at night. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of rope against wood. Edward Fairchild ordered Vance buried quickly, in the far corner of the plantation's small cemetery, away from the family plots. The funeral was perfunctory, a few words from a traveling preacher, no mourners except those required to be there. The grave was filled in, a simple wooden cross placed at the head, and everyone tried to pretend that life would return to normal. But life at Thornhill would never be normal again. Within a week, Edward hired a new overseer, a younger man named Porter, perhaps 35 years old, who came with good references from a plantation in Chesterfield County. Porter was less openly brutal than Vance had been, but no less effective. He believed in discipline through fear, in maintaining absolute control, in showing no weakness. He lasted exactly 9 days. On his 9th night at Thornhill, Porter was making his evening rounds, checking that all the enslaved people were in their quarters, that no one was where they shouldn't be. He carried a lantern and a pistol, and he walked with the confidence of a man who feared nothing. He went to the stables last, as was his habit, to check on the horses and make sure the building was secure for the night. Jacob, who slept in a small room attached to the stables, heard him enter, heard his footsteps on the wooden floor, heard him speaking to the horses in a low voice. Then Jacob heard something else. A gasp, a strangled cry, the sound of the lantern hitting the floor. Then silence. Jacob, frightened, stayed in his room with the door barred. He didn't emerge until morning, when he found Porter standing in the center of the stable, his face pale as death, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. The lantern lay on the floor, its glass shattered, the oil soaked into the straw. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting. "Mr. Porter?" Jacob said tentatively. "You all right, sir?" Porter turned to look at him, and Jacob took an involuntary step back. The overseer's face was wrong somehow, not injured, not marked, but wrong, as if he'd aged 10 years in a single night. "The tree," Porter whispered. "The oak tree. He's still there, still hanging, still watching. Ain't nobody there, Mr. Porter. Mr. Vance is buried. I saw him." Porter's voice rose to a shout. "I saw him, hanging there, his face. He couldn't continue. He pushed past Jacob and ran from the stable. By noon, Porter had packed his belongings and left Thornhill, refusing to explain, refusing to stay even one more night. He rode away on his horse, looking back over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Edward tried to convince him to stay, offered him more money, but Porter wouldn't even discuss it. "There's something wrong with this place," he said. "Something evil. I won't stay here. I won't end up like Vance." And he was gone. Edward hired a third overseer, a hard man from North Carolina named Garrett, and warned him about the foolish superstitions among the enslaved people. Garrett laughed and said he didn't believe in ghosts. He'd been managing slaves for 20 years, he said, and he'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained by natural causes. He lasted 2 weeks. On his final night at Thornhill, Garrett was found at dawn, wandering the tobacco fields, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding, his face scratched as though he'd been running through brambles. He was muttering to himself, his words barely coherent. "The boy," he kept saying, "the boy in the stables. The eyes, the same eyes. He knows. He knows what was done. He knows." They brought him to the house, tried to calm him, tried to get him to explain what had happened. But Garrett couldn't or wouldn't say. He just kept muttering about eyes and knowing and the boy in the stables. By midday, he had recovered enough to pack his things. He left that afternoon without collecting his wages, without saying goodbye, without looking back. After that, Edward couldn't find anyone willing to serve as overseer. Word had spread through the county. Thornhill Plantation was cursed, haunted, wrong. 3 overseers in less than a month, 1 dead, 2 driven away by something they couldn't or wouldn't name. No amount of money was worth that risk. The enslaved people, left largely unsupervised, continued their work out of habit and fear. They knew that if the plantation failed, they would be sold away, families separated, lives destroyed. So they worked the fields, tended the animals, maintained the buildings, kept the routines going. But the discipline that had once ruled Thornhill had collapsed. Without an overseer, without constant supervision, the rigid structure began to crack. And Thomas Fairchild, now 10 years old, had begun asking questions. The questions started innocently enough. Thomas asked Bess, the cook, about the boy who used to work in the stables. He asked old Jacob where Samuel had gone. He asked the other enslaved people if they knew anything about his mother's family, about his grandfather, about the history of the plantation. Most of them deflected his questions, gave vague answers, tried to avoid engaging with the boy. But Thomas was persistent. He had inherited his father's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, and Dinah's question had planted a seed in his mind that wouldn't stop growing. He came to the kitchen often, always when Bess was elsewhere, always seeking out Dinah. At first, she tried to avoid him, afraid of what might happen if she was caught speaking to the master's son. But Thomas was insistent, and gradually, carefully, she began to tell him things. Not everything. Not the full truth that Edward had revealed to her in his study, but pieces of it, fragments that a 10-year-old mind could grasp. She told him about Samuel, about how kind he'd been, how he'd carved little animals from wood and given them to the younger children in the quarters. She told him about their mother, Ruth, who had died of fever, who had been gentle and sad. She told him in careful language that sometimes masters had children with enslaved women, and those children were born into slavery despite their parentage. Thomas listened with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. He asked questions that showed he understood more than he should. But if a master has a child with a slave woman, isn't that child his son or daughter? Doesn't that make them family? By blood, yes, Dinah said carefully, but not by law. The law says the child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is enslaved, no matter who the father is. But that's not fair. No, young master, it's not fair. And Samuel, he was your brother, your full brother. Yes, and he looked like me. Dinah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he looked like you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young face troubled. Why did he look like me? This was the dangerous question, the one Dinah couldn't answer directly. You'd have to ask your father that, young master. I did ask him. He won't tell me. He says I'm too young to understand, that I shouldn't concern myself with such matters. Thomas looked at her with those pale grey eyes, Samuel's eyes. But I do understand. I understand that Samuel was my uncle, that he was my grandfather's son, that he was family and father sold him anyway. Dinah said nothing. What could she say? The boy had worked it out himself, had put the pieces together. He was 10 years old, and he understood the fundamental horror at the heart of his world. It's wrong, Thomas said quietly. All of it. It's wrong. Yes, Dinah agreed. It's wrong. And slowly, over the course of those summer conversations, Dinah watched something change in the boy's face. The innocence was leaving him, being replaced by a knowledge that no child should have to carry. He was beginning to understand what he was part of, what his family had done, what his very existence meant. He was beginning to understand that he was both victim and beneficiary of a system built on lies and violence, that his comfort came at the cost of others' suffering, that his inheritance was built on stolen lives and broken families, and that knowledge was destroying him. On the night of August 27th, Thomas Fairchild disappeared. Edward discovered it at breakfast when the boy didn't appear. Thomas was usually punctual, appearing in the dining room at 7 o'clock sharp, as Mr. Gaines had trained him. When he didn't come down, Edward sent a house servant to check on him. The servant returned with troubling news. Thomas's bed was unslept in, his window was open, and the boy was nowhere to be found. Edward's reaction was immediate and frantic. He gathered every enslaved person on the plantation, lined them up in front of the main house, and demanded to know if anyone had seen Thomas. His voice, usually so controlled, was ragged with fear. "If anyone knows where my son is, speak now. If anyone has helped him, hidden him, hurt him, speak now, and your punishment will be less severe than if I discover it later." No one spoke. No one knew anything. The enslaved people looked at each other, confused and frightened. Thomas had disappeared, and no one had seen or heard anything. Edward sent riders to neighboring plantations, to the town of Lunenburg, to the river crossings. He offered a reward for information, $50, an enormous sum. He questioned everyone again, individually this time, but no one knew anything. Days passed. The search expanded to cover the entire county. Neighbors joined in, organizing search parties to comb the woods and fields. The sheriff returned, bringing deputies, searching for any sign of the missing boy. But Thomas had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. Edward was beside himself. He didn't sleep, barely ate, spent his days and nights searching, calling his son's name, offering prayers to a God he'd never particularly believed in. The plantation's work came to a halt as everyone focused on finding the missing boy. On the third day, Dinah came to Edward's study. She knocked on the door, waited for permission to enter, and stepped inside. Edward looked up from his desk, his face haggard, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "What is it?" His voice was hoarse. "I know where he is," Dinah said. Edward stood up so quickly his chair fell over backward. "Where?" "The old slave cemetery, past the tobacco fields near the woods." Edward stared at her. "Why would he be there?" "Because I told him about it, about the people buried there, about—" She hesitated. "About his grandmother, Ruth." Edward's face went white. "You told him—" He asked about Samuel's mother. "I told him the truth. I told him where she was buried." For a moment Dinah thought Edward might strike her again, his hand clenched into a fist, his whole body tensed. But then he seemed to deflate, all the anger draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and despair. "Show me," he said quietly. They walked together through the tobacco fields, past the work sheds, into the woods. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows. Birds sang in the branches overhead, oblivious to human drama. The old slave cemetery was perhaps a quarter-mile into the woods in a small clearing. It was where the enslaved people buried their dead, away from the white cemetery near the main house. The graves were marked by rough wooden crosses and fieldstones, most of them weathered and leaning. The names were remembered only in the memories of the living, passed down through oral tradition, because enslaved people weren't allowed headstones with inscriptions. They found Thomas sitting beside one of the graves, his back against a tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He'd been there for 3 days, apparently, sleeping in the woods, drinking from the creek, eating nothing. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face scratched from branches, his lips cracked from thirst. When he saw Edward, he didn't move. He just looked at his father with those pale grey eyes, Samuel's eyes, Edward's eyes, and said, "She's buried here, Ruth, my grandmother." Edward stopped several paces away, as though afraid to come closer. "Thomas, you need to come home." "Why?" The boy's voice was flat, emotionless. "So I can pretend I don't know? So I can grow up and own my own cousins and half-siblings and pretend it's normal?" "Thomas, Samuel was my uncle." Thomas stood up, his small frame shaking. "My uncle and my half-brother, both. And you sold him. You sold your own brother's son, and you didn't even care." "It's not that simple." Yes, it is. Thomas's voice rose to a shout, echoing through the trees. It's exactly that simple. You did it. Grandfather did it. And now I'm supposed to do it too, aren't I? That's what you're teaching me. That's what all of this is for. So I can grow up and do the same things, own people, sell people, pretend they're not human. Edward took a step forward. You don't understand. You're too young to understand how the world works. I understand that it's wrong. Thomas was crying now, his words coming in gasps. I understand that we're monsters, that our whole family is built on being monsters, that everything we have, everything we are, is built on hurting people and pretending it's normal. Edward reached for his son, but Thomas jerked away. Don't touch me. You're not my father. You're just a man who owns people, who owns his own children, who sold his own brother. The boy turned and ran, not toward the house, but deeper into the woods. Edward called after him, but Thomas didn't stop, didn't look back. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Edward standing alone among the graves. Dinah, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a few paces back, said quietly, "Let him go. He'll come back when he's ready." Edward turned on her, his face twisted with rage and grief. "This is your fault. You did this. You destroyed my son with your questions and your truths." "No." Dinah interrupted, her voice steady. "You destroyed him. You and your father and all the men like you. You built a world on lies and violence, and now your son can see it for what it is. I didn't do that. I just made him see what was already there." Edward raised his hand as if to strike her, then let it fall. He looked suddenly old, defeated, broken. The master of Thornhill Plantation, who had controlled so much, who had wielded such power, stood among the graves of the people his family had owned and looked like a man who had lost everything. "Get back to the house," he said quietly. Dinah turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone among the unmarked graves, calling his son's name into the indifferent woods. Thomas returned to the house that evening, silent and hollow-eyed. He went to his room and locked the door. Edward tried to speak with him, standing in the hallway, pleading through the locked door, but the boy wouldn't answer. The next morning, Thomas emerged and resumed his daily routine as though nothing had happened. But something fundamental had broken in him. He moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, his face expressionless. He ate his meals in silence, did his lessons mechanically, spent his free time alone in his room. Edward watched his son with growing desperation. He tried to explain, to justify, to make Thomas understand the necessities of their world. He talked about economics, about the way society was structured, about how slavery was legal and accepted and had existed for thousands of years. He talked about duty and inheritance and the responsibilities of their class. But Thomas wouldn't listen. He had seen the truth, and he couldn't unsee it. He had understood the horror, and he couldn't unknow it. In September, Edward made a decision. He would send Thomas away to boarding school in Richmond, away from Thornhill and its ghosts, away from Dinah and her dangerous truths, away from the graves in the woods and the questions they raised. Perhaps distance would heal what had been broken. Perhaps Thomas would forget, would learn to accept the world as it was, would grow into the master he was meant to be. But before he could make the arrangements, something happened that would make all such plans irrelevant. September brought cooler weather to Virginia, the first hints of autumn in the air. The tobacco harvest was underway, the enslaved people working long days to bring in the crop before the first frost. The leaves were cut, hung in the curing barns, tended carefully to ensure they dried properly. It was the most important time of the year, the work that would determine whether the plantation made money or lost it. But the work was proceeding slowly, inefficiently, without proper supervision. Edward tried to manage it himself, but he was no overseer. He didn't know the details of the work, didn't know how to drive people to maximum productivity, didn't have the presence or the brutality to command absolute obedience. The enslaved people worked, but at their own pace. They took breaks when they needed them, helped each other, looked after the elderly and the children. Without constant supervision, without the threat of immediate punishment. They created their own rhythms, their own systems. The work got done, but not as quickly or as efficiently as it would have under Vance's brutal management. Edward watched this with growing frustration, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. He couldn't find anyone willing to serve as overseer. He couldn't manage the work himself. And he couldn't sell everyone and start over. That would destroy the plantation's value, would leave him with nothing. He was trapped, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his strange, silent existence. He went through the motions of daily life, but seemed disconnected from everything around him. He did his lessons with the new tutor, a timid young man from Lynchburg who lasted exactly 3 weeks before departing, claiming the atmosphere at Thornhill was oppressive, but showed no interest in learning. He ate his meals but tasted nothing. He slept but had nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. And he continued to seek out Dinah, continued to ask questions, continued to try to understand the incomprehensible. One afternoon in mid-September, Thomas found Dinah in the kitchen garden picking vegetables for dinner. Bess was inside, and they were alone. Thomas sat down on the ground beside her, watching her work. "I've been thinking," he said after a long silence, "about what you said, about how the law says children follow the condition of the mother." Dinah continued picking beans, dropping them into her basket. "Yes, young master. So if a free woman has a child with an enslaved man, the child is free?" "Yes. But if an enslaved woman has a child with a free man, the child is enslaved." "Yes." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "That's designed to benefit the masters, isn't it? So they can have children with enslaved women and not have to free them. So they can increase their property." Dinah looked at him, surprised by his insight. "Yes, that's exactly what it's designed to do. And my grandfather, he had children with enslaved women. With your mother, with others." This was dangerous territory, but Dinah decided to answer honestly. "Yes, Ruth was not the only one. So I have uncles and aunts who are enslaved, cousins, half-siblings maybe." "Yes." Thomas picked up a stick and began drawing patterns in the dirt. "And father knows this?" "Yes. And he doesn't care." Dinah chose her words carefully. "I think he cares. I think it troubles him. But he doesn't know what to do about it. The system is bigger than any one person. Your father didn't create it. He just inherited it. Like he inherited this plantation. But he could change it. He could free people. He could acknowledge his family. He could. But it would cost him everything. His wealth, his status, his place in society. And it wouldn't change the system. Other plantations would still exist. Other enslaved people would still suffer. Your father freeing his slaves wouldn't end slavery." Thomas threw the stick away. "So we're all trapped. The enslaved people are trapped because they're property. And we're trapped because we benefit from owning them, and we can't give that up without losing everything." "Yes," Dinah said quietly. "That's exactly right. It's evil," Thomas said. "The whole thing is evil." "Yes." They sat in silence for a while, Dinah picking vegetables, Thomas staring at nothing. Finally the boy said, "What happened to Samuel? Where did they send him?" "South. That's all I know. The trader was heading to Mississippi or Alabama to the cotton plantations." "Is he? Will he be all right?" Dinah didn't answer immediately. How could she? The cotton plantations were notorious for their brutality, for working enslaved people to death and replacing them with new purchases. Samuel was young and strong, which might help him survive. But he was also light-skinned, educated, marked by his resemblance to the family that had owned him. That might make things harder. "I don't know," she finally said. "I hope so. I pray so. But I don't know." Thomas nodded slowly. Then he said something that chilled Dinah to her core. "I wish I'd never been born. I wish I didn't exist, because my existence is part of this. I'm part of the evil." "Young master, it's true. I benefit from it. I eat food grown by enslaved people. I wear clothes made by enslaved people. I live in a house built by enslaved people. Everything I have, everything I am, is built on their suffering. And someday, I'm supposed to inherit all of this. Supposed to become the master. Supposed to continue it. He looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. I don't want to. I don't want any of it. I'd rather die than become what my father is, what my grandfather was. Don't say that, Dinah said urgently. You're young. You can choose differently. You can be different. Can I? Or am I already too corrupted? Already too much a part of it? Dinah didn't have an answer for that. She just continued picking vegetables, and Thomas sat beside her in silence, both of them trapped in a system neither had created, but both were part of. That night, Edward Fairchild sat in his study, drinking whiskey and going through Horace Vance's personal effects. After the overseer's death, his belongings had been packed up and stored in a trunk in the attic. Edward had finally decided to go through them looking for... what? He didn't know. Answers, maybe. Understanding. The trunk contained the usual things. Clothes, a razor, a pipe, some money. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, Edward found a small leather journal. He opened it and began to read. The journal was Vance's private record, kept over many years. It contained notes about the plantation's operations, observations about the enslaved people, records of punishments administered. But it also contained something else. A careful accounting of bloodlines. Vance had kept track of which enslaved children had been fathered, by which white men. He had noted resemblances, recorded births, tracked family connections, and he had paid particular attention to the children of the old master, Edward's father. As Edward read, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. Samuel was not the only child his father had sired with enslaved women. There had been others, many others. Over the course of 30 years, the old master had fathered at least a dozen children with enslaved women on the plantation. Some had died young, some had been sold away, but several were still at Thornhill, working in the fields, living in the quarters, bearing the Fairchild blood in their veins. Edward recognized some of the names. Peter, who worked in the smithy, he was Edward's half-brother. Mary, who worked in the laundry, she was Edward's half-sister. Jacob, the old man who tended the horses, he was Edward's half-brother, older than Edward himself. The plantation was full of Edward's siblings, his father's children, all of them enslaved, all of them property. The Fairchild bloodline was tangled beyond comprehension, white and black mixed together, family and property impossible to separate. And then Edward found the entry that explained everything. The entry that explained why Vance had killed himself. It was dated 3 days before Vance's death, written in the overseer's careful hand. Discovered today the full extent of the old master's activities. Samuel is not simply the master's son, he is also the master's grandson. Ruth, Samuel's mother, was herself the old master's daughter by a woman named Celia, which means Samuel is the product of incest, the old master lying with his own daughter. The boy carries double Fairchild blood, is both son and grandson to the same man. This explains his strong resemblance to the family. This explains why the master has always been uncomfortable around him. This explains everything, but it also means that young Thomas and Samuel are not merely uncle and nephew, they are also second cousins. The bloodlines are so tangled that I can barely trace them. How many others are there? How many other children born of these unholy unions? How deep does this corruption go? I have served this family for 8 years. I have done terrible things in their service. But I did them believing in the order of things, believing in the rightness of the system. Now I see that there is no order, no rightness. There is only corruption and lies, generation after generation, blood mixing with blood, until no one knows who they are or where they came from. God forgive me. God forgive us all. That was the last entry. 3 days later, Vance had hanged himself from the oak tree. Edward sat in his study, the journal open on his desk, and felt the world tilting around him. His father had not only fathered enslaved children, he had fathered children with his own enslaved daughter, had committed incest, had created children whose bloodlines were so tangled that they defied comprehension. Samuel was both Edward's half-brother and his nephew. Ruth had been both Edward's half-sister and Samuel's mother. The family tree was not a tree at all, but a twisted vine, looping back on itself, creating connections that should never exist. And Edward himself, what was he? The son of a man who had committed unspeakable acts, the brother of people he owned, the uncle of his own brother, the master of his own family. He thought of Thomas, his son, who was beginning to understand these truths. He thought of Dinah, who had asked the question that started this unraveling. He thought of all the enslaved people at Thornhill, so many of them carrying Fairchild blood, all of them trapped in this web of corruption. The system had seemed so orderly, so rational, so justified. But beneath the surface, it was chaos. It was horror. It was an abomination that corrupted everyone it touched. Edward closed the journal and sat in the darkness, drinking whiskey, trying to understand how his world had come to this. If you're still watching, you're witnessing one of the darkest revelations in American plantation history. The truth about Thornhill is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined, a web of incest, corruption, and blood so tangled that it defies comprehension. Hit that like button if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, and drop a comment telling me what you think will happen next, because we're only halfway through this nightmare, and the worst is yet to come. Let's continue. The discovery of Vance's journal changed everything for Edward Fairchild. He spent the next several days in his study, going through the plantation's records, trying to trace the bloodlines, trying to understand the full extent of his father's actions. The more he discovered, the worse it became. His father had not been discreet. He had not limited himself to a few women. Over the course of 30 years, he had systematically violated dozens of enslaved women, fathering children with many of them. Some of these women had been very young, 14, 15 years old, when he first took them. Some had been the daughters of women he'd already violated, creating generation after generation of tangled bloodlines. And the current enslaved population at Thornhill reflected this history. Nearly a third of them carried Fairchild blood. They were Edward's siblings, his nieces and nephews, his cousins. They were family, and they were property, and there was no way to separate these two facts. Edward tried to imagine freeing them, acknowledging them, making things right. But how? If he freed everyone with Fairchild blood, he'd be freeing nearly 20 people, destroying the plantation's labor force, bankrupting himself. And what would he tell them? I'm sorry my father raped your mothers and grandmothers. I'm sorry you were born into slavery because of his actions. Here's your freedom. Now figure out how to survive in a world that will never accept you. It was impossible. There was no way to make this right. The damage was too deep, too extensive, too fundamental. And Thomas knew. Maybe not all the details, but enough. The boy understood that his family was built on horror, that his inheritance was poisoned, that he was part of something evil. Edward didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to protect his son from this knowledge. He didn't know how to continue living with what he now understood. He began drinking more heavily. He stopped sleeping. He wandered the plantation at night, walking through the quarters, looking at the cabins where his siblings lived, trying to reconcile what he knew with what he saw. One night, he encountered Dinah outside the kitchen house. She was sitting on the step, unable to sleep, looking up at the stars. Edward, drunk and desperate, sat down beside her. You asked a question, he said without preamble. Why does young master look exactly like your brother? Do you want to know the full answer? Dinah looked at him warily. Sir, Samuel wasn't just my half-brother. He was my nephew, my father's son and grandson. Because Ruth was my father's daughter, my father raped his own daughter and fathered Samuel. That's why the resemblance is so strong. That's why Samuel looked so much like Thomas. Because the blood is doubled, concentrated. Dinah stared at him, horror dawning on her face. Ruth was my half-sister, yes, and your mother, which makes you my niece. which makes this whole plantation a cesspool of incest and corruption. Edward laughed bitterly. That's what Vance discovered. That's what killed him. Not guilt over Samuel being sold, but the knowledge of how deep the corruption goes, how many generations it's poisoned. Dinah couldn't speak. She had known her mother had been violated by the old master. She had known Samuel was the result. But she hadn't known that Ruth herself had been the old master's daughter, that her mother had been forced to bear a child to her own father, that Samuel had been the product of incest. The horror of it was overwhelming. "I'm sorry," Edward said quietly. "I'm sorry for what my father did. I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry for all of it. But sorry doesn't fix anything, does it? Sorry doesn't undo the past. Sorry doesn't free anyone or heal anyone or make anything right." He stood up, swaying slightly. "Your question destroyed everything. But everything deserved to be destroyed. This place, this system, this family, it's all rotten. It's all evil, and I don't know how to fix it." He walked away, leaving Dinah sitting on the step, her mind reeling with the revelation. The next day, Thomas came to Dinah in the kitchen. Bess had gone to the smokehouse, and they were alone. The boy looked terrible, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. "I need to know the truth," he said without preamble. "All of it. Everything you know about Samuel, about my grandfather, about the family. I need to know." Dinah hesitated. "Young master, I don't think—" "Please." Thomas's voice broke. "I can't live with not knowing. I can't live with pieces of the truth. I need to understand what I'm part of, what my family has done. Please." So Dinah told him. She told him about Ruth, about how she'd been the old master's daughter. She told him about Samuel, about how he'd been the product of incest. She told him about the other children, the tangled bloodlines, the generations of horror. Thomas listened in silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When Dinah finished, he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, and stared at nothing. "So Samuel was my uncle and my second cousin," he said finally. "And Ruth was my aunt and my grandmother. And half the people on this plantation are my family, and we own them. Yes, and my grandfather, he raped his own daughter. He committed incest. He created children who are so inbred that—" Thomas couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes." The boy was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I can't live with this. I can't grow up and inherit this. I can't become part of this. Young master, no." Thomas stood up, his face set with determination. "No, I won't. I won't be part of this anymore. I won't inherit this evil. I won't continue it." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving Dinah frightened by the look in his eyes. That night, September 15th, 1847, fire broke out in the main house of Thornhill Plantation. It started in Edward Fairchild's study in the early hours of the morning when everyone was asleep. Later, people would speculate about how it started. A lamp left burning, a spark from the fireplace, an accident. But it was no accident. Thomas Fairchild had started the fire deliberately. He had waited until his father was asleep, had gone to the study, had taken Vance's journal, the evidence of his family's sins, and had set it alight. Then he had set fire to the curtains, the books, the papers, everything that would burn. He wanted to destroy it all, the evidence, the history, the records. He wanted to burn away the past, to erase the horror, to make it as though none of it had ever happened. But fires don't discriminate. They consume everything. By the time the alarm was raised, the entire first floor was engulfed in flames. The enslaved people formed bucket brigades from the well, but the fire spread too quickly, fed by the dry wood and the books and papers that filled the house. The flames roared up through the floors, consuming everything in their path. Edward was pulled from his bedroom on the second floor by Jacob and Peter, both of them risking their lives to save their master, their half-brother. He was unconscious from smoke, his nightshirt singed, his face blackened with soot. They carried him out to the lawn and laid him on the grass, where he coughed and gasped and slowly regained consciousness. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. Dinah, watching from the kitchen yard with the other enslaved people, felt her heart stop. She knew, with terrible certainty, where Thomas was. Without thinking, she ran toward the burning house. Hands grabbed at her, voices shouted, but she pulled free and plunged through the front door into the inferno. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke choking. The entrance hall was a mass of flames, the grand staircase burning like a torch. Dinah couldn't see, could barely breathe. But she knew the house's layout, had walked these halls 100 times. She made her way by memory and desperation toward the study. The study door was open, the room a mass of flames. And there, in the center of the room, she saw him. Thomas, standing motionless, holding something in his hands. Vance's journal. The leather cover was burning, the pages curling and blackening, but Thomas held it as though it were precious. He was staring at the flames consuming the journal, watching the names and dates and terrible truths turn to ash. Thomas! Dinah screamed his name, but he didn't seem to hear. He was transfixed by the burning journal, by the destruction of the evidence. Dinah lunged forward, grabbed the boy, and pulled him toward the door. Thomas didn't resist, didn't help, just let himself be dragged like a rag doll. The journal fell from his hands, consumed instantly by the fire. They made it to the hallway, then to the front door, then out onto the porch. Hands pulled them down the steps, away from the house. Dinah collapsed on the grass, coughing, her lungs burning, her hands blistered from the heat. Beside her, Thomas lay on his back, staring up at the sky, his face blank. "It's gone," he whispered. "All of it. All the names. All the proof. All the evidence of what we did." Dinah looked at him, then at the burning house. She understood what he'd done. He'd started the fire deliberately to destroy the journal, to erase the evidence of his family's sins. But fires don't discriminate. They consume everything. And now the main house of Thornhill Plantation was burning to the ground, taking with it not just the journal but all the family records, all the account books, all the physical evidence of the Fairchild family's history. By dawn, the main house of Thornhill Plantation was a smoking ruin. The walls still stood, blackened and hollow, but everything inside was gone. The furniture, the books, the records, the portraits, all the physical evidence of the Fairchild family's history reduced to ash. Edward Fairchild sat on the ground near the ruins, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. He had lost everything: his home, his records, his account books, his father's papers. The plantation could still function, the fields and outbuildings were intact, but the heart of it was gone. And his son, his only child, sat beside him with that same blank expression, saying nothing. The county sheriff came that morning to investigate. He questioned everyone, examined the ruins, and concluded that the fire had been an accident. Perhaps a lamp left burning in the study, perhaps a spark from the fireplace. These things happened in old houses, especially with all those books and papers. No one mentioned that Thomas had been found in the study, holding a burning journal. No one mentioned that the fire had started in the one room that contained evidence of the Fairchild family's darkest secrets. No one mentioned that the boy had been talking about destroying the past, about erasing the horror. The enslaved people knew, of course. They always knew, but they said nothing. What would be the point? The truth had been burned away, and with it, any proof of their own tangled bloodlines and stolen heritage. Dinah, her hands wrapped in bandages, watched as the sheriff departed. She had saved Thomas's life, had pulled him from the fire, but she couldn't save him from what he'd learned, from what he'd become. The boy who had asked questions, who had wanted to understand, who had been horrified by his family's sins, that boy was gone. In his place was someone hollow, someone who had chosen to destroy the truth rather than live with it. In the days following the fire, Thornhill Plantation existed in a strange limbo. The main house was a blackened shell, uninhabitable. Edward moved into one of the overseer's cottages, the one that Porter had briefly occupied, and tried to figure out what to do next. He could rebuild, but it would take years and money he didn't have. He could sell the plantation, But who would buy a cursed place with a burned house and a reputation for driving overseers mad? He could try to continue as before, but without records, without proper housing, without the structure that had held everything together. He was paralyzed by indecision, by grief, by the weight of everything he now knew. Thomas remained in his strange, hollow state. He spoke when spoken to, ate when food was put in front of him, moved through the days like a ghost. Edward tried to reach him, tried to connect with him, but the boy was unreachable. Whatever had broken in him during those 3 days in the woods, whatever had shattered when he learned the full truth about his family, could not be repaired. The enslaved people continued their work, but the atmosphere at Thornhill had changed fundamentally. Without an overseer, without constant supervision, without the threat of immediate punishment, they had created their own systems, their own rhythms. They worked, but they also rested. They helped each other, looked after the children, tended to the sick and elderly. In the absence of brutal control, something like community had emerged, but they all knew it couldn't last. Eventually, Edward would hire a new overseer, or sell them all, or something would change. The brief respite would end, and the brutality would return. That was the nature of the system. Dinah spent her days in the kitchen, working with Bess, trying to process everything that had happened. She had asked a question that had destroyed an overseer, driven away 2 more, revealed terrible truths, and ultimately burned down the main house. She had set in motion a chain of events that had consumed everything it touched. Had she been right to ask the question? She didn't know. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? Samuel was gone, sold away to a fate she couldn't imagine. Thomas was broken, his childhood destroyed by knowledge no child should have to carry. Edward was ruined, his world collapsed around him. And the enslaved people at Thornhill, while they might have gained a brief respite, were still enslaved, still property, still trapped in the system. The truth hadn't freed anyone, it had only destroyed. One evening in late September, as Dinah was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, Thomas appeared in the doorway. He looked terrible, thinner than ever, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. "I'm leaving," he said without preamble. "Father is sending me to boarding school in Richmond. I leave tomorrow." Dinah set down the pot she was washing. "Young master, I wanted to thank you," Thomas interrupted, "for telling me the truth, for answering my questions, for pulling me from the fire. You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Thomas came closer, and Dinah could see tears in his eyes. "You're the only person who's been honest with me. Everyone else lied or stayed silent or tried to protect me from the truth, but you told me, even though it was dangerous, even though it could have gotten you killed. You told me the truth. I'm sorry the truth hurt you so much. Don't be sorry. I needed to know. I needed to understand what I'm part of, what my family has done." Thomas wiped his eyes. "I'm going to Richmond, and I'm going to study, and someday I'm going to be a lawyer. And I'm going to use the law to fight this system. I'm going to spend my life trying to undo what my family has done." Dinah looked at this 10-year-old boy, this child who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had been broken by the truth and was trying to put himself back together with purpose and determination. "I hope you succeed, young master," she said quietly. "My name is Thomas, not young master, just Thomas." He held out his hand. "And you're not a slave. You're Dinah. You're my aunt. Your family." Dinah stared at his outstretched hand. In the world they lived in, this gesture was revolutionary. Enslaved people didn't shake hands with white people. Property didn't shake hands with owners, but Thomas was offering his hand, acknowledging their relationship, treating her as family. Slowly, Dinah reached out and took his hand. They shook, formally, solemnly, sealing something that neither of them could quite name. "Goodbye, Dinah," Thomas said. "Goodbye, Thomas." The boy turned and walked away, and Dinah never saw him again. The next morning, Thomas Fairchild left Thornhill Plantation for Richmond. He would spend the next 8 years at boarding school, then attend the University of Virginia, then study law. He would become a lawyer, as he'd promised, and he would spend his life fighting against slavery. When the Civil War came, Thomas would refuse to fight for the Confederacy. He would be ostracized by his neighbors, threatened by former friends, but he would not waver. After the war, he would work with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people navigate their new freedom, fighting for their rights in court. He would never marry, never have children. The Fairchild line would end with him, and he would consider that a blessing. He would never return to Thornhill, never set foot on the plantation again. He would live in Richmond until his death in 1891, at the age of 53, and he would be buried in a public cemetery, far from his family's graves. But all of that was in the future. On that September morning in 1847, he was just a 10-year-old boy leaving the only home he'd ever known, carrying knowledge that no child should have to carry, determined to spend his life making amends for sins he hadn't committed but had inherited. Edward Fairchild never recovered from the fire. He tried to continue running the plantation, but his heart wasn't in it. He drank heavily, slept poorly, and spent his days wandering the grounds like a ghost. The enslaved people, seeing his weakness, worked less and less. The tobacco crop that year was poor, and the plantation lost money. In 1848, Edward hired a new overseer, a man named Collins who came from Georgia. Collins was brutal and efficient, and he restored order to Thornhill through fear and violence. The brief respite the enslaved people had enjoyed was over. The whippings resumed, the punishments increased, the brutality returned. But Edward took no satisfaction in it. He had seen behind the curtain, had understood the horror at the heart of the system, and he couldn't unknow it. He continued as master because he didn't know what else to do, but he took no pleasure in it. In 1852, Edward Fairchild died of a fever. He was 48 years old. He was buried in the family cemetery on the hill beside his wife Catherine, beneath a simple stone that gave his name and dates and nothing else. Thomas, then 14 years old, inherited Thornhill Plantation but never returned to live there. He hired a manager to run the estate and stayed in Richmond. The plantation continued to operate, continued to produce tobacco, continued to enslave people, but Thomas took no active role in it, and when the war came, he would sell it for whatever he could get. Dinah remained at Thornhill until the war. She worked in the kitchen, lived in the quarters, and carried her knowledge like a weight. She had asked a question that had destroyed everything, and she lived with the consequences. She watched as new overseers came and went, as the brutality continued, as the system ground on. She watched as children were born into slavery, as families were separated, as people died and were buried in the unmarked graves in the woods. And she remembered. She remembered Samuel, her brother, sold away to the cotton fields of the Deep South. She remembered Ruth, her mother, who had been violated by her own father. She remembered Thomas, the boy who had been broken by the truth. She remembered Edward, who had been destroyed by knowledge he couldn't handle. She remembered the question she had asked, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" It had been a simple question, pointing out a simple truth. But that truth had been too dangerous to speak, too explosive to contain. It had destroyed an overseer, driven away two more, broken a child, ruined a master, and burned down a house. And yet Dinah didn't regret asking it, because the truth mattered, because silence protected no one, because the lie at the heart of the system was so monstrous that it had to be exposed, no matter the cost. The Civil War came to Virginia in 1861, and with it came the beginning of the end for Thornhill Plantation. The enslaved people, hearing rumors of freedom, began to run away. Some went north following the Underground Railroad. Some went to Union lines seeking protection. Some simply disappeared into the woods and were never seen again. By 1863, Thornhill's enslaved population had dropped from 47 to fewer than 20. The tobacco fields lay fallow, the buildings fell into disrepair, the plantations slowly died. In 1865, when the war ended and the 13th Amendment was ratified, the remaining enslaved people at Thornhill were freed. They took their freedom and scattered, some staying in Virginia, some heading north, some going west to start new lives. Dinah was 37 years old when freedom came. She stayed in Lunenburg County, working as a cook and laundress, saving her money, building a life. She married a man named Joseph, a former slave from a neighboring plantation, and they had 3 children together. She lived to see her children grow up free, to see them learn to read and write, to see them build lives that would have been impossible under slavery. She lived until 1889, dying at the age of 61 in a small house she owned, surrounded by grandchildren who were born free. In her final years, she would sometimes tell the story of the question she'd asked, the question that had changed everything. "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" she would say, her voice still clear despite her age. That's all I asked. Just that one question, and it brought down a whole world. Her grandchildren would ask what happened to Samuel, to Thomas, to all the people in the story, and Dinah would shake her head. Some of them died, some of them lived, but they were all destroyed by the same thing, the truth they tried to hide. The truth that we were all family, all blood, all human, but some of us were property and some of us were masters, and that lie poisoned everything it touched. She would look at her grandchildren born into freedom and say, "Don't ever be afraid to ask questions. Don't ever let anyone tell you that some truths are too dangerous to speak, because the real danger isn't in the truth. It's in the lie. The lie is what destroys. The lie is what kills. The truth might hurt, but it's the only thing that can heal." Thomas Fairchild died in 1891, at the age of 53. He had spent his adult life fighting against the system he'd been born into, working for justice and equality, trying to make amends for his family's sins. He died alone in his Richmond apartment, his body found by a neighbor 3 days later. His will left his modest estate to organizations working for racial justice and education. He left nothing to any relatives. He had none that he acknowledged. He requested to be buried in a public cemetery, not in the Fairchild family plot, and his wish was honored. On his tombstone, he had requested a simple inscription: "He tried to do better." The ruins of the Fairchild house stood for decades after the fire, a blackened shell slowly being reclaimed by the Virginia woods. Local children would dare each other to explore it, to walk through the empty rooms where ghosts were said to linger. They told stories about the overseer who hanged himself, about the boy who burned down his own house, about the slave girl who asked a question that destroyed everything. In 1923, the last standing walls finally collapsed in a storm. The land was cleared, and a new house was built on the site by people who knew nothing of the Fairchild family or their secrets. The new owners were a middle-class family from Richmond, and they lived there happily for many years, untroubled by ghosts or curses. But the old slave cemetery still exists, hidden in the woods past where the tobacco fields used to be. The wooden crosses have long since rotted away, the names forgotten. But the stones remain, marking graves that hold the bodies of people whose names were never written down, whose lives were never recorded, whose truths were too dangerous to speak. Ruth is buried there, though no one knows which grave is hers. Her story, violated by her own father, forced to bear his child, dying young and sad, is remembered only in the oral traditions of her descendants, passed down through generations. Samuel's grave is somewhere in Mississippi or Alabama, unmarked and forgotten. Whether he survived the cotton fields, whether he lived to see freedom, whether he had children who carried on his line, no one knows. He disappeared into the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade and was never heard from again. Horace Vance lies in the far corner of the white cemetery, his death officially a suicide, his secrets buried with him. His grave is unmarked now, the wooden cross long since rotted away. No one remembers him except as a footnote in the story of Thornhill Plantation. And somewhere in the ash and ruins of Thornhill Plantation, In the place where Edward Fairchild's study once stood lie the burned remains of a leather journal that contained names and dates and terrible truths. Truths that a 10-year-old boy decided the world was better off not knowing. Whether he was right or wrong, no one can say. The evidence is gone. Only the stories remain. In the decades after the Civil War, as the South struggled with Reconstruction and its aftermath, the story of Thornhill Plantation became a local legend. People told different versions, emphasized different details, drew different conclusions. But the core of the story remained the same. A young enslaved woman had asked a question about resemblance, and that question had destroyed everything. Some said it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of speaking truth to power. Some said it was a story about the corruption at the heart of slavery. Some said it was about the price of silence and the cost of revelation. But for the descendants of the enslaved people of Thornhill, for Dinah's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for the families who carried Fairchild blood in their veins whether they knew it or not, the story had a different meaning. It was a story about the power of truth, about the importance of asking questions, even dangerous ones, about the necessity of speaking what everyone knows but no one will say. Because the alternative, the silence, the lies, the pretending, that was what had created the horror in the first place. The system of slavery had depended on silence, on everyone agreeing not to acknowledge the obvious, not to name the truth, not to point out that masters were raping enslaved women and then enslaving their own children. Dinah's question had broken that silence, and yes, it had destroyed things. But the things it destroyed deserved to be destroyed. The lies, the pretense, the careful fiction that allowed the system to function, all of that needed to be torn down. The truth was painful, the truth was destructive, but the truth was also necessary. Today, if you visit Lunenburg County, Virginia, you can still find traces of Thornhill Plantation. The land has been divided and subdivided, sold and resold, but the basic geography remains. The river still flows along the eastern boundary. The woods where the slave cemetery lies are still there, though you'd need a guide to find them. The house that stands on the site now is modern, comfortable, unremarkable. The family who lives there knows nothing of the Fairchilds, nothing of the question that destroyed everything, nothing of the ghosts that local legend says still walk the grounds. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, they hear things. Footsteps when no one is there, whispers in empty rooms, the creak of rope against wood, though there's no rope and no tree. They dismiss it as old houses settling, as wind in the eaves, as imagination. And maybe that's all it is. Or maybe some truths are so powerful, so fundamental, that they leave echoes that persist long after everyone involved is dead and gone. Maybe Dinah's question still resonates, still demands an answer, still refuses to be silenced. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? It was a simple question, but it contained within it all the horror of slavery, all the lies that sustained it, all the truth that would eventually destroy it. And the answer that everyone knew but no one could say, was this: because they were family. Because blood doesn't care about law or custom or race. Because the system that said some people could own other people was built on a lie so fundamental, so monstrous, that it poisoned everything it touched. That was the truth that Horace Vance couldn't live with. That was the truth that broke Thomas Fairchild. That was the truth that destroyed Edward Fairchild and burned down his house. And that was the truth that Dinah carried for the rest of her life, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of grim satisfaction. She had spoken the truth. She had asked the question that needed to be asked. And if the truth destroyed things, well, those things deserved to be destroyed. The story of Thornhill Plantation is not unique. Across the South, on thousands of plantations, similar stories played out. Masters fathered children with enslaved women. Families became tangled beyond comprehension. Truths were hidden, lies were maintained, and everyone pretended not to notice the obvious. Most of these stories were never told. Most of the questions were never asked. Most of the truths remained buried. But every once in a while, someone like Dinah came along. Someone who was tired of the silence, tired of the lies, tired of pretending. Someone who asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one would say. And when that happened, when the truth was finally spoken aloud, everything changed. Not always for the better, not always in ways that could be predicted or controlled, but always, inevitably, permanently. Because some truths once spoken can never be unspoken. Some questions once asked can never be unanswered. And some lies, no matter how carefully maintained, will eventually be exposed. That's the real horror of Thornhill Plantation. Not ghosts or curses or supernatural vengeance, but the simple, terrible truth that the system itself was the horror. That the lie at its foundation, that some people could own other people, that blood and family meant nothing compared to property and race, was so monstrous that it poisoned everything it touched. Dinah's question didn't create that horror. It only revealed it. And in revealing it, she showed that some truths are so powerful, so dangerous, that people will do anything to keep them hidden, even destroy themselves. But the truth will out. Always. Eventually. No matter how many people die to keep it secret, no matter how many houses burn, no matter how many lives are destroyed, the truth will out. And that, perhaps, is the only comfort in this dark story. That the lies couldn't last forever. That the system built on those lies eventually fell. That the truth, painful and destructive as it was, ultimately prevailed. Dinah lived to see slavery end. She lived to see her children born free. She lived to see the beginning of a new world, one where the old lies no longer held power. It wasn't the world she would have chosen. It wasn't perfect or just or fair, but it was better than what had come before. And it existed in part because she had been brave enough to ask a question. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? That question changed everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's what questions are supposed to do. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation, where a simple question about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror that destroyed everyone who touched it. It's a story about truth and lies, about silence and revelation, about the cost of speaking and the cost of staying quiet. It's a story that reminds us that the most terrifying horrors aren't supernatural. They're the ones we create ourselves, the lies we build our lives upon, the truths we're too afraid to face. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Dinah was right to ask her question, even knowing the destruction it would cause? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American history and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the disturbing truths hidden in our past. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.